Reach across time and see yourself. You stand tall against terrifying enemies. You build masterpieces and break down barriers. You rush into the future and meet your past. For every time, at every moment, the official network of every millennium. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
The State Department says that terrorism is the single greatest threat now facing the United States and the world. Our program looks at terrorism in the recent past, including the attacks that have brought the scourge to American soil. Terrorism is defined as the calculated use of violence to inculcate fear, and no era has been more fearful than the final 3 decades of the 20th century. Join us now as the History Channel presents 100 Years of Terror, the Fright Decades.
Terrorism was so horrendous during the 1970s that it was called Fright Decade Number 1. West Germany's trauma was the kidnapping and murder of industrialist Hans Martin Schleyer and the Munich Olympic massacre of Israeli athletes. And Italy's was the kidnapping and murder of former Prime Minister Aldo Moro by the Red Brigades. It would get even worse in the 1980s, Fright Decade Number 2. And in the 1990s, terrorism came to the United States. This is the story of terrorism at the end of the millennium. Throughout the 1970s, the Red Brigades terrorized Italy and nearly destroyed democracy there. The death toll was horrendous. Kidnappings, bombings, and maiming, spreading terror and fear. The government responded with a brutal counter-terrorist campaign that nearly tore Italy apart. The Red Brigades, Brigate Rosse, was formed at a time of political turmoil and industrial unrest. They believed capitalism was corrupt, decayed, that it exploited workers and must be destroyed. Their aim was to force the government to take such repressive measures that workers would rise up and overthrow it. They nearly succeeded.
They were, say, sons of an ideology. And the ideology was the one of destroying anything in order to rebuild another one, another world. A position of extreme left, the extreme left, communist, but not official communism, not even Leninism. I would say something beyond.
Alberto Franceschini was one of the founders of the Red Brigades. He spent 16 years in prison for his involvement in the Red Brigade's violent activity.
Certo, chi entrava in questa organizzazione.
No doubt that whoever joined an organization like that joined with the knowledge that there was a program, a very precise and specific one, of the use of violence. It could be a reduced violence, like blowing up a car at the beginning, but already the choice of blowing up a car or adopting a false identity with false documents, that was a choice that dictated the way of armed struggle, and it became even more blatant in the following years.
The Red Brigades launched a terrorist campaign with acts of sabotage against factories in Milan and Genoa. Soon its tactics escalated to kidnapping, murder, and maiming, including kneecapping or shooting victims in the knees.
Among the categories, the magistrates, members of the judiciary, politicians, but not so much, intellectuals, professors, and they were the more exposed.
Professor Gino Guido teaches labor law at LUISS, the University of Rome. He considers himself a social reformer. He was kneecapped.
It was in the evening, around 7 p.m. I had come back from the university to my office. Then I saw two young men on a motorcycle.
Shot twice in his knee, Professor Guido was severely disabled. For the Red Brigades, the attack was a political statement to spread fear and terror among intellectuals and politicians. In 1974, Italian anti-terrorist police arrested Renato Curcio, one of the founders of the Red Brigade, and a year later killed his wife in a shootout. It appeared that the Red Brigades had been broken. Not so. Terrorist attacks increased, numbering more than 700 in 1975 alone. When the trial of Renato Curcio finally got underway in March 1978, the Red Brigades decided to strike at the heart of the state. They targeted one of the country's most distinguished elder politicians, former Prime Minister Aldo Moro, leader of Italy's Christian Democratic Party. Early on the morning of March 16, 1978, Aldo Moro was on his way to work when 4 Red Brigades terrorists ambushed his convoy, spraying a hail of automatic gunfire into Moro's Fiat 130 and his escort car in the heart of Rome. More than 200 bullets were fired, but none hit the man they wanted to kidnap. They shoved Moro into a waiting car and sped away, undetected, to a safe house. When the police arrived at the scene, they found the 5 lifeless bodies of Moro's driver, bodyguard, and 3 security agents. The operation was a mirror image of a kidnapping that took place only 6 months earlier in Germany, when Red Army faction terrorists kidnapped the industrialist Hans Martin Schleyer, a carbon copy method with similar demands.
From the
beginning, we certainly had contacts with other groups like us to move forward to armed struggle, especially German groups who became our comrades, members of the RAF. I can testify from my own experience. There was first and foremost among those movements an exchange of logistics, exchange of information concerning the structure of the groups, techniques that should be used.
The Red Brigades hid Moro in an apartment in a quiet suburb of Rome and announced that he would undergo a people's trial. A few days later, the Red Brigades demanded the release of Renato Curcio and all Red Brigades prisoners. Otherwise, Moro would be executed. The Italian authorities refused to exchange him for any Red Brigades prisoners and launched a massive manhunt. A letter from Moro pleaded, "We are almost at 0 hour, seconds rather than minutes from the end." Then, after silence for 11 days, this chilling communique. "We have concluded the battle begun on March 16th by carrying out the sentence to which Aldo Moro has been condemned." On May 19th, after 54 days, Moro's body was found in a luggage compartment of a Renault R4 parked in the center of Rome. He had been shot 11 times in the chest. At first, the Red Brigade saw the assassination as an achievement, but in time they began to realize that it was a grave mistake.
Even for those who had done it, all in all, it was conceived as a great tragedy, individually and personally as well. Also because the political consequences of the Moro murder were totally negative.
One by one, tough Italian anti-terrorist squads hunted down, captured, and arrested the Red Brigade's assassins. Moro's murder marked the beginning of their downfall.
Without trying to sound Christian religious, but you really do experience hell You cross a certain line when you kill someone and enter a horrifying territory about which you prefer not to talk. It's something you cannot express in words.
Far to the north of sunny Italy, the Fright decade would claim thousands of lives in one of the longest and most vicious terror campaigns in the late 20th century. Northern Ireland. As it was in Italy, the year 1970 was an ominous turning point in the annals of terrorism in Ireland. It was the year the newly formed Provisional Irish Republican Army launched its terrorist campaign to drive the British out of Northern Ireland. The Provos, as they were called, had broken away from moderate IRA members who favored a political approach to the problem. They favored violence and a strategy of random terrorism. Everyday life in Northern Ireland was tense. The Protestants of Ulster made life miserable for the Catholics, who had become second-class citizens. British troops were called in to protect the Catholic minority and were soon hated by both sides.
The situation in Northern Ireland is complicated. It's not simply the IRA versus the British government or the British Army. There's 1 million Protestants in Northern Ireland who support the link with Britain, who support the British government. The most effective counter-terror campaign that emerged was from Protestant terrorists who replied to IRA violence by killing innocent Catholics, hundreds of them, over the period of the last 25 years. So, almost 1,000 assassinations of innocent Catholics were carried out by Protestant terrorist groups in answer to the IRA violence.
The Provos aimed to produce a breakdown of law and order, forcing the British to abolish the Protestant government and impose direct rule over Northern Ireland. Since the 1970s, more than 60,000 people have been arrested and held for interrogation by the British. Many suspects were tortured and confined in degrading conditions. As the cycle of violence escalated, the brutality and cruelty of the IRA also intensified. Eamon Collins was an IRA hitman, an assassin who believed in a war of no compromise.
Was an important phase of our struggle. I was asked to do it, and I did it. I was needed, and I had to do it.
Collins grew up in Northern Ireland at a time when the popular uprising was at its peak. What started with locals throwing stones developed rapidly into Molotov cocktails, car bombs, and assassinations. The British reacted with arrests, curfews, dawn raids on family homes. In the formative years of his life, Collins, like many others of his generation, suffered humiliation and oppression at the hands of the British.
When I grew up, there was the situation that you began to realize that you were a second-class citizen. I was a first-year law student, and I believed that justice could be achieved through law. And I was not in support of violence. And I came home at Easter on my Easter break, a holiday break from university. And I was arrested. And paratroopers beat me badly, put a rifle in my mouth, and told me they would blow my brains out. And I watched when it took us for interrogation. And my father, who had reared 6 of us, I watched him as he was being pushed about by these burly paratroopers, these great big soldiers. And I said, here's my father, who has toiled all his life for us, to feed us, to care for us. And here are these men treating him like a dog. And from that day, I no longer believed that the law could deliver equality.
Now we will attach a detonator to our fuse.
In 1978, at the age of 24, Collins decides to take an active part in the struggle against the British occupation and joins the IRA.
Strike it along the match.
Collins goes through intensive terrorist training. He masters a variety of different weapons and is taught the art of bomb making and explosive technology, courtesy of Libya and the PLO.
It's a very light machine gun, and it's very, very useful for taking strong points to give covering fire. This is its main use.
Some of our people did go to Libya, some of our people did meet Palestinian liberation people, some of our people did learn bomb tactics. Some of our people learned some of the new technologies used in bombing. That was done. Some of our people did train in some of the camps. Absolutely.
The PLO was useful because it gave the IRA facilities for training, and also thanks to the PLO, these organizations had connections with Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, which established an arms supply route from the Middle East through Czechoslovakia, through East Germany, into France and into Ireland. And that arms supply route was used right up until the late 1980s.
The IRA has been behind successive waves of bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, extortion, and robberies. Being an IRA recruit meant a life of dedication to the cause and a commitment to violence.
After a number of years as an active provisional, I found myself living what I did. And what I did was kill. And each day I got out of bed trying to determine what or who the next kill would be. It was as simple as that. I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop because I was part of a movement that took me on. I couldn't stop because I was a killer. I was an assassin. I had been involved in assassination after assassination, of bombing after bombing, and killing after killing. I dealt with men who pulled guns and shot people dead. I watched men who took out Browning pistols and were excited with this prospect of their first kill. Men who were excited by the prospect of influencing their senior officers. And I watched as mistakes was made, as we shot men dead in front of their wives, in front of their children, as these men went to work. And I watched children scream as their fathers were shot dead.
In 1974, the IRA exported their campaign to mainland England, hoping to force the British to withdraw from Northern Ireland. The IRA targeted populated areas, bombing railroad and subway stations, shopping areas, department stores, and public buildings. Since its terrorist campaign began in 1970, the IRA has killed nearly 900 British soldiers and policemen. Hundreds of civilians have died in indiscriminate attacks. By the 1980s, the IRA served as an example to other terrorist groups around the world, admired for its experience, political sophistication, and propaganda skills, also its expertise in the use of explosives.
The provisional IRA had a very concrete impact. It was the provisional IRA invented the car bomb in 1972. It was the invention of Daithí O'Connell, who was on the Army Council of the provisional IRA. And it occurred to him, he had IRA men carrying 50 pounds worth of explosives into police stations, dropping it on the floor and running out. It occurred to him, well, why don't we just put it in the back of a car and drive it? And we can put 100 pounds, 200 pounds, and just park the car and go. No one had thought of that before.
To support its ambitious terrorist campaign, the IRA needed arms and explosives, and money to buy them. Many supportive Irish communities in the United States, particularly in the Boston area, contributed enormous sums of money. George Harrison was one of the principal arms smugglers from the United States to Northern Ireland.
Me and the group, the people I was with, there's nobody works alone. We became like not the source of supply, but fairly good, substantial. At once over 2,500 and over 1 million rounds of weapons of different type of different caliber.
And over a period of what time?
That would be over a period of almost 30 years.
The IRA also received financial aid from international terrorist groups and foreign sponsors. During the Cold War in the 1970s, support came from the Soviet bloc. Soon, Libya became the IRA's main sponsor. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya flooded the IRA with money, arms, and explosives. His reason was personal: revenge.
In 1985, the link was renewed, with Gaddafi supplying, over a period of a year and a half, supplying the IRA with 120 tons of weapons, and included among those were 4 tons of Semtex, the plastic explosives.
We got 120 ton of weaponry. We got a lot of Semtex. We got SAM 7 missiles. We got many, many AK-47s.
In the case of Gaddafi, he wanted to get revenge on Margaret Thatcher for her alliance with the United States, particularly after April 1986, when Britain was used by the United States Air Force as a resupply base when they bombed Tripoli. US jets took off from Air Force bases in the United Kingdom on their bombing raid to Tripoli in April of 1986. Gaddafi wanted revenge for that.
And it was a gift. And all they wanted was our people to use it to best effect, and our people did. The Semtex was devastating. What a gift Semtex was.
This is the funeral of the man you just met, Eamon Collins, murdered by the IRA. He was arrested by the British, informed on his associates, and paid for it with his life. In the last 30 years, more than 3,200 victims have died in Ireland's terrorist violence. Their graves stand as a grim reminder of the vicious cycle of terrorism and counterterrorism. In the 1980s, Fright decade number 2, terrorism escalated dramatically and became more ferocious. In northern Spain, ETA, a Basque separatist group, tried to bomb the Spanish out of the Basque region and even murdered a prime minister. Turkey was ripped apart by terrorist violence, both from revolutionaries of the radical left and neo-fascists of the right. The Soviet Union fanned the flames, trying to destabilize Turkey, a loyal member of NATO. In France, a terrorist group called Action Direct bombed department stores and created mass hysteria. Their tactics were similar to those of the Red Brigades in Italy and the Red Army faction in Germany. And in Japan, a radical left terrorist group, the Japanese Red Army, with close links to Palestinian groups, launched a campaign of bombings and political assassinations. By the end of the decade, they were crushed by Japanese anti-terrorist forces. During the 1980s, terrorists in the Middle East increasingly targeted Americans. The new threat came from state-sponsored terrorism. Iran, Syria, Libya, and Cuba were the main sponsors. Hezbollah was backed by Iran, and the notorious Abu Nidal, backed by Libya, became an extension of Libyan intelligence. In the first 5 years of the Reagan administration, more than 300 Americans were killed by terrorists. The attack stunned the United States and exposed the lack of an American anti-terrorist policy. The Israeli eye for an eye policy let the terrorists know that the price of terrorism would be high. Over the years, the Mossad tracked down and killed every terrorist involved in the 1972 Munich Olympic massacre. the United States decided to follow Israel's example and fight back.
When terrorism strikes, civilization itself is under attack. No nation is immune. There's no safety in silence or neutrality. If we permit terrorism to succeed anywhere, it will spread like a cancer, eating away at civilized societies and sowing fear and chaos everywhere. This barbarism is abhorrent, and all of those who support it, encourage it, and profit from it are abhorrent. They are barbarians.
Washington now considers international terrorism a threat to national security. Both the FBI and the CIA have created high-tech, state-of-the-art anti-terrorism centers. Good intelligence has become a top priority. In 1988, American intelligence discovered that the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine Central Command had developed altimeter-sensitive bombs that could be placed in radio cassette recorders. These could easily be hidden in luggage compartments, programmed to explode when the aircraft reached a certain altitude. Unfortunately, the intelligence did not prevent the tragedy of Pan Am Flight 103 on December 21, 1988. The aircraft exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 270 people. The impact of terrorism depends on the fear it creates. In the 1980s, terrorists have been successful at exploiting the vital link between the news media, public opinion, and decision makers.
Terrorist activities are mainly propaganda. An explosion is a statement, is a deadly political statement. So the media are, in a certain way, part of the game.
Terrorism depends on media coverage, and particularly live television. In 1986, one incident, the hijacking of TWA Flight 407, marked the beginning of sophisticated media exploitation by a terrorist group.
Beirut Control, TWA 407, request landing instructions. Able to give you landing instructions due to the closure of the airport, sir. Advise the hijackers that. I think they understand English. Well, yeah, they do, but they're insistent upon landing at Beirut. Okay, you have no permission to land Beirut Airport. It's up to you and to the hijackers to go on. He has full violation and he is ready to blow up the aircraft if he has to. We must, I repeat, we must land at Beirut. We must land at Beirut. No alternative. Okay, sir. Land quietly. Land quietly. It's up to you, sir. As you know, the airport is not in my hands.
The drama of TWA Flight 407 played out before a worldwide live television audience.
They figured out how to play us like a violin.
Have you been well treated? Yes. Captain Strait, do you have any idea what's happened to the passengers on the aircraft?
No, except we've been told that they've been taken to a safe place.
We almost became only technicians for the terrorists. We provided the cameras and the lights, and they provided the script and the players, the hostages, the props, the guns.
They even put hostages in front of live cameras.
Ed Whitmoyer from Baltimore, Maryland. Severn, Maryland.
What do you have to say?
I'd just like my family to know that I am doing okay, and I pray that I get home to see them and be with them real soon.
The problem with terrorism, from the point of view of the media and its responsibility, is that it provides pictures, emotions, situations that are just irresistible to the news media. Buildings blowing up, planes exploding, bodies being thrown out of windows, hostages beaten up and talking on bad VHS copies. That stuff is news. And as we define it, it meets every standard of news as we define it. And the fact that the people who are behind these things, the terrorists, the people holding the guns, have a point and are playing a game and are trying to get our attention is not something that we really reflect upon in the heat of the moment.
For many years, most international terrorists wanted a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. Publicity for their causes. That would soon change. For religious terrorists, a high body count is more important. Since the 1980s, terrorists have become increasingly motivated by religion. Religious fanaticism with a political agenda is a highly dangerous combination. During the 1990s, they have been responsible for the majority of deaths in terrorist attacks. And as recent carnage in the 1990s graphically illustrates, they have become extremely efficient. The turning point from secular to religious terrorism came in 1979, following the Iranian Revolution. Iran became the world's first Islamic republic and exported its religious revolutionary zeal to the Middle East and targets in Western Europe and the United States. The first modern religious terrorist groups began to appear in 1980, embracing a volatile mixture of faith, fanaticism, and violence. For the religious terrorist, violence is a sacramental act, a divine duty. The missions begin with sacred rituals, the swearing on the Quran, then the strapping of powerful explosives to their bodies, and the self-sacrifice that results in terrible carnage. It is a holy mission. This unique film was shot by a member of the mission. The white car heads toward an army truck transporting Israelis. It is driven by a young suicide bomber. Suicide bombing has become the spearhead in the psychological warfare of terrorism. The worst attack came on October 23, 1983, when a suicide bomber drove a Mercedes truck into the U.S. Marine barracks near Beirut International Airport. The Marines were in Lebanon on a peacekeeping mission. The truck driver set off 12,000 pounds of explosives, killing 241 American Marines and sailors. The pro-Iranian terrorist group Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility for the attack. Iranian instructors have trained religious terrorists in Lebanon and helped plan many of the attacks. This is Hassan Salameh. He is responsible for the death of 40 people killed by suicide bombers in Israel. Shortly after his arrest by Israeli security, he reveals details of his mission.
I was supposed to put together the explosive materials. How? The TNT, I had experience because I had gained experience outside the country. So I knew about TNT and I knew how to put together the electrical charges.
The killings were in retaliation for the assassination of his commander in Hamas. Yitya Ayash was an expert in explosives, a bomb maker. At the age of 30, he was a high-ranking member of Hamas and the brains behind a series of suicide attacks. An electrical engineer by education, he was named the engineer by the Israelis. He became #1 on their most wanted list. On January 5, 1996, Ayash received a call on his cellular phone. It was his last. Packed with 2 ounces of TNT, the phone exploded in his face. He died instantly. Ayash's death hit the Hamas like a bombshell. They vowed to retaliate. 40 days later, Hassan Salameh packed a car with explosives and drove to Jerusalem to recruit volunteers for the suicide mission. He is an expert in explosives and reveals for the first time that Syria, the Sudan, and Iran have been training religious terrorists.
It was a military training in the faction of Ahmad Jibril. Normal training in shooting and explosives and in everything that you might have to use. And from Syria I went back to Sudan. Afterwards I went to Iran. Yes. And I got training in Iran. In Iran, who were your instructors? Iranian instructors. At the site, someplace in Iran. I don't know where. I never left the place. Was it a military place? Yes. Did you see Iranian soldiers? Yes.
In Jerusalem, he recruits Ibrahim Sarakni, who will blow himself up in the city of Ascalon. Majdi Abu Wardi, who will sacrifice himself in Jerusalem, and Rayed Sharnubi, also assigned to kill and die in Jerusalem.
Jihad does not stop until the Day of Judgment. Jihad is continuous.
But religious terrorism is not confined to the Middle East or Islam. For many years, Americans believed that such violent acts would not occur on American soil. But in 1993, that would change, tragically.
Current temperature readings for us right now, we have 18 at Englewood.
In 1993, terrorism came to the United States.
Traffic, transit information, well, slippery driving throughout the...
It is 11:20 a.m. Friday, February 26, 1993.
New Jersey's down wires.
A yellow Ford Econoline van weaves its way into Manhattan's Holland Tunnel. The driver cautiously steers the vehicle, packed to the roof with explosives. Several trash cans containing a mixture of nitric acid and urea. It is a homemade explosive called urea nitrate, extremely powerful and cheap to produce. For the terrorists, the bombing would be a sacramental act, a divine duty ordained by a Muslim cleric. Soon the target comes into view, the World Trade Center, the very symbol of Western capitalism and prosperity. At 11:43 a.m., the van pulls into the basement of the World Trade Center. Above, one of the world's key financial hubs purrs away. In the bowels of the garage, one of the men lights a homemade fuse wired into the 1,000-pound bomb. The terrorist and his driver have 20 minutes to get away. A waiting car rushes the pair back to the anonymity of New York streets. At 12:05, the city plunges into turmoil. The bomb rips through 5 levels of parking garage, killing 6, injuring nearly 100. But it could have been worse. The terrorists had planned to topple one of the 110-story twin towers on top of the other, and to release a deadly cloud of poisonous gas, sodium cyanide, into the damaged tower that would have killed any survivors. The World Trade Center bombing was an ominous turning point in the history of terrorism. For the first time, Muslim religious extremists had struck at the heart of the infidel, the symbolic capital of their hated enemy, the United States.
The World Trade Center bombing in 1993 for the United States was almost a period of before Christ and after Christ with the type of problem we had.
It is the first international terrorist attack on American soil, a new milestone in terrorism's deadly annals. The most sinister and frightening turning point in this escalating litany of death and destruction came on March 20th, 1995. Tokyo, Japan, 8 o'clock Monday morning. As thousands of commuters headed for work, members of a mysterious religious cult placed canisters of deadly sarin nerve gas on 5 subway trains. Nerve gas is invisible and odorless. As the trains converged in the heart of downtown Tokyo, the commuters poured out of the subway stations, overcome by the gas. The nerve gas attack killed 12 passengers and injured more than 5,000. The terrorists were members of a doomsday sect called Om Shinrikyo, which means supreme truth. But the nerve gas attack was to be just the beginning of an apocalyptic assault on Japanese society. Even more disturbing, the cult had planned more deadly attacks using lethal biological agents, anthrax, botulinum toxin, and bubonic plague. The Tokyo nerve gas was a frightening milestone in the history of terrorism. Terrorists were now willing to cross the line, to use weapons of mass destruction to kill as many people as possible, to terrorize an entire population. At the end of the 20th century, terrorism has reached such a dangerous point that counterterrorism programs are now an integral part of every nation's budget. International cooperation is essential in this deadly war against terrorism.
International terrorism requires an international response. And I think very, very clearly, if you look at the relationships between governments, that our allies in the United States do not have a tolerance for terrorism. So there is tremendous cooperation, information sharing, joint projects, so that we're always in a position where we're identifying what is that current definition of terrorism and form of terrorism, and what is our legal appropriate response to prevent terrorism.
These are the new terrorists. In the Middle East, Islamic fundamentalists. In Afghanistan, the Saudi millionaire Osama bin Laden, believed to be behind the deadly attacks on the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, which claimed 243 lives. In Japan, the members of the Om Shinrikyo sect. And in the United States, the American Christian Patriots, responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168. As the new millennium begins, the profiles of today's and tomorrow's terrorists are ominous and chilling. They are religious fanatics, more ruthless and cold-blooded, with access to high technology and lethal weapons of mass destruction.
Well, there certainly was and partly is a myth of terrorism, namely its secret and mysterious character, the fact that terrorism hits suddenly without any warning. People get afraid, who will be the next victim, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if we look at the balance to this day, there are very few cases where terrorism has brought about a lasting change. Now, having said all that, I must add that we are now on the eve of a new period. A new period which is characterized, A, by a growth of fanaticism, and what's more important, by the much greater access to a few groups of people to means of mass destruction. In other words, a few people, perhaps in the near future, will be able to kill not dozens, not 300 people, but thousands, tens, and maybe hundreds of thousands.
The only certainty is this: terrorism is with us, well entrenched. And whether we like it or not, we can expect another 100 years of terror.
The strategy in the war against terrorism has been to prevent terror through intelligence and infiltration. As 1999 was drawing to a close, there was fear that terrorists would ring in the new millennium with bombs. FBI agents visited the homes of suspected terrorists across the country, mainly to let them know they were under surveillance. But the only explosions heard on New Year's Eve came from popping corks and fireworks. One anti-terrorism expert likens his job to being a goalkeeper. You can make 100 saves, but the only shot people remember is the one that gets past you.